John Seeley Brown describes three different eras requiring different ways of living, working, and learning. He said when he was growing up, his father told him, think of your career as a steamship. Set a direction for your life and don't let anything get in your way. But he found that his career was a lot more like a sailboat. Play with the wind, adjust to the natural forces of change. He says now we're entering an age where living, learning, and working is a lot more like whitewater kayaking. You're constantly being buffeted by rapids, and you have to adjust, learn, and relearn to navigate your way through. So how can we better support learners in a whitewater world, one in which continuous learning and relearning is needed? Well, one vision is massive open online courses and other educational technologies that aim to scale access to high-quality content. And there's been a lot of great research on helping MOOCs to not just scale content, but to improve them in ways that integrate peer support, critique, discussion, so that you can actually leverage learner activity to improve or add new content. But MOOCs are still centered around the delivery of content, and that's not sufficient for the experiential learning that's also needed for the real world. Think apprenticeships. This is still the primary way we transition from the foundational conceptual knowledge learned in school to the experiential, situated knowledge that's needed for work. Right? Work is embedded in a complex context that contains a lot of tacit knowledge. But apprenticeship learning is really hard to scale. It takes a lot of time for someone to prepare, mentor, and coordinate the learner, and learners might not be able to contribute very much. Any contributions they do make might not last after they leave. And that's why getting that first internship is so hard. It's a vicious cycle where you need experience to build experience. And usually you need to commit an entire summer or some other large amount of time. So that brings us to our vision. Is it possible to provide learners with small experiential roles, things that you can do in a free evening or in a weekend, but that can still sequence into pathways for mastering professionally relevant skills? To answer that question, I want to go back to how this project started, some of our formative work. It actually didn't start with learning. It started with how do we organize volunteers to support nonprofits in complex objectives like building websites. We had been talking to refugee resettlement agencies, and they were interested in changing the way they provided various services, for example, by bringing their cultural orientation process online. Now, the problem was that even though the things they wanted to do weren't very hard technically, nonprofits just don't have access to that kind of expertise. And that made us start to think about how do you coordinate volunteers, many of whom are short-term, they're novices, to do complex tasks like web development. And we thought that learning might be a critical mechanism to achieving this. Could we teach people web development so that as they learned, they would automatically power the development and hopefully even maintenance of websites for nonprofits? So in our first prototypes, we tried with students who said they were already experienced, but it still didn't work. And the problem was that they were experienced in a lot of different technologies or practices, so when they were handing work off from one person to another, it would often fail miserably. When you have people helping for just a small amount of time for a complex project, essentially everyone's a novice. To counter this, a second prototype, we spent a lot of time writing really detailed guides and workflows for a particular way of developing websites, and we focused on people who were complete novices and just on a small piece, creating the static view of a web app. It still didn't work. And it didn't work because it was too overwhelming and convoluted. The level of detail was just too much. But one thing we noticed across both of these cases was that people were really, really motivated. They wanted to do a lot more work than they had signed up for. And that's what made us realize that the learning goals themselves were just as important as the crowdsourcing goals. And it sparked another thought. In the same way that learning was critical for crowdsourcing, we thought maybe could crowdsourcing also be critical for learning? What do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to the vision. Is it possible to provide learners with small experiential roles that sequence to professionally relevant skills? Well, if that's going to be sustainable, then there has to be a way for learners to actually contribute to real-world work. Because if they are able to, then there's going to be incentives for people to provide those opportunities for learning. We call this doing by learning, the act of accomplishing complex real-world goals through novices that are engaged in learning by doing. And our thought was, well, maybe learning by doing is only scalable if doing by learning is possible. Now, that's probably too strong of a statement, but it gets at what we think is an important idea, which is scaling situated learning by making it possible for novices to support complex crowd work. And there's three ways we think about this. One, doing learning is an incentive mechanism that makes mentorship sustainable. Two, it's the technologies you need to make it work. We're going to talk about one in this talk, but I think that more ideas are needed. And then three, I started to think about it as almost an aspirational goal or standard. When I'm teaching a class, I ask myself, would these students be able to actually contribute to something real world as they're learning? If not, how can I make it possible? This is going to be important in the world of AI and automation. Heather McGowan says, in the past, we learned in order to work. Now we must work to continuously learn. That's exactly what doing by learning is about. Okay, so let's talk about what we did more concretely. So we couldn't get to work. People are really interested. And then it finally worked. In the field study we conducted, we organized 22 novices to build static views of web apps using HTML and CSS. Most of the participants who signed up were novices. They said they were either completely new or they were still uncomfortable with CSS. For the remaining 23% that said they were comfortable, they still said they stuck to the basics and needed guidance. And it worked. So these novice participants were able to create the static views of web pages. On the left is the high-fidelity mockup. On the right is the rendered code. You can see that it essentially matches, minus tiny pixel-level positioning. The novices really loved it. They really, really loved it. But the people who were already comfortable or well-versed, they rated it lower because they found it a little constraining. The ability to learn the concepts in a way that they're applied quickly and then practiced on pages for real-world use is rewarding and makes the material stick better. I like the assignment of mini roles. It really helps in understanding and not feeling too overwhelmed. Let's talk about these mini roles. We call them micro-role hierarchies. They're a structure for coordinating complex work that naturally also supports situated learning. We're going to talk about them in the context of Causeway, which is a platform we developed for learning web development. Using Causeway is very similar to using other websites for learning coding online. You sign in, you're faced with some learning modules. Typically, these would be things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. In our case, they're roles. So they're things like elements developer, layout developer, page manager, and they're scoped to a couple hours each. When you navigate into one of these roles, it's, again, very similar. It's broken down into a sequence of steps that alternate between tutorials for learning and then practicing what you learned in an interactive coding environment. The main difference is that these exercises aren't just concepts to learn within a topic, they're actual steps within a process for completing the role you were assigned. So for example, in our study, there's 3 micro roles. The first, the elements developer, you're responsible for declaring and styling individual elements of a single component. And you go through a sequence of steps. So initially, you get introduced to HTML. Then you learn how to declare a text element. You do it for your component. You learn how to style. You do it. You learn how to declare images, format your code, style images, etc. You get the idea. Step-by-step process, we learn something, and you do it for your assigned component. Once you've completed the elements developer role, then now you move on to the layout developer. Now you're given individual elements that you've already styled, and your responsibility is to position them to create a responsive layout for that component. Again, there's a step-by-step workflow for doing it. You'll notice that these are workflows, so you can have loops and you can have if statements. They're just a process for how you get that role done. These are some of the components that were assigned to these first 2 roles. You can see that most of them are pretty simple, even as simple as a number and a label. A couple of them are more complex, where there's, you have to, let's say, create a shape with pure CSS, or there's more pieces that are moving. After you finish these first two roles, then you would move on to the page manager. Your first step would be to decompose the page into smaller components. And then you start to encounter what we call delegated steps. So these are steps where you've created these components, and now you delegate them out for others to complete. Once they're completed, the page manager stitches them together to create the final layout for the entire page. And the most interesting thing, of course, is that as you're working through this sequence of micro roles, you're actually doing real-world work, because the learning pathway is coupled to a process for completing the desired goal as represented in the hierarchy. Think of each role in this hierarchy as a function, right? The root role is the overall goal you're trying to achieve, like create the static view of page X. And the role has a workflow, the steps you need to take to complete the goal. That's like the algorithm. And this algorithm can have subroutines that are computed in the process, and those subroutines, those are the child roles. Child roles can have their own delegated steps, and so on. So you end up with a hierarchy that represents an algorithmic process for carrying out a goal. And the learning pathways can be thought of as moving your way up this hierarchy from the lower level roles to the higher level ones. So how does it work? Well, from that crowdsourcing perspective, micro-hierarchies, they're integrating some of the strengths from microtask workflows with the strengths from hierarchies. Right? The predetermined workflows make it possible to create really granular roles which are needed for short-term novices to be able to contribute. And the hierarchies, well, the higher level roles make it possible to preserve context across the different tasks. From the learning perspective, there's a couple things going on. First, they're providing a minimal version of apprenticeship learning. So there's 3 stages of apprenticeship learning: modeling, coaching, and fading. And the workflows and guides in micro-hierarchies, they're in some sense providing a form of modeling. They're showing you a particular way you might complete the task. If we compare it to open source, normally in open source you engage in what's called legitimate peripheral participation. You do a bunch of peripheral tasks, and you slowly make your way into the core like peeling an onion. But you might never get there. One way of thinking about micro-hierarchies is they're allowing learners to take a thin but deep slice into the core of a complex task so they can quickly develop context for how what they're learning applies to the overall goal. Micro-hierarchies, they're also encouraging deliberate practice by reducing each of the 3 primary obstacles. So the workflows, they're helping with resource constraints. The missional alignment, it's helping with motivational constraints. And the small consumable micro roles, that's helping with effort constraints. So the main result of our field study, which we already talked about, was just that it actually worked. We had novices successfully build out 3 different static web pages. I didn't get to spend much time talking about the details of the study, but I hope you'll read the paper. I'll quickly summarize some of these. 1, we validated that people were novices by using control and showed that they improved when using Causeway. And we showed that people could successfully hand off components between micro roles, and that they were faster the second time they did a component. On the negative side, the rigid structure of the workflows was pretty annoying for the few people who did have experience, and that's why they rated it lower. Also, not all the components were done correctly. Some had to be rejected and redone by others. So for learning to work well for everyone, people would need to do more repetitions before moving on to the next role. There's a lot of work we're interested in doing to build on this. I'm personally very excited about the bigger picture of doing by learning, but for micro-hierarchies themselves, we also need to understand how to design hierarchies for more complex tasks, think about coaching, and how do we create these hierarchies at scale. There's a lot of very closely related work in this space that I find really fascinating and inspired at work. Work on learning in online labor markets, work on computational ecosystems to better support experiential learning. I want to end with some acknowledgments. This is my first HCI paper. I actually used to do mathematical models and proofs during my PhD, and I was super jealous that you guys actually get to think about users. So I started moving into HCI and the transition from PhD to faculty, and I just want to thank Michael Bernstein, Joe Kim, Rajan Vaish, Liz Gerber for a lot of advice and encouragement in that transition. I want to thank John Seeley Brown for perspectives on learning, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you all and being part of this community. Thank you.
questions, please come to the microphone. Also, if you do prefer to write your question down, I believe one of the SBs can coordinate that for you.
Really nice work, Haoqi, Northwestern University. One thing I was curious about is in the current hierarchies that you're using, it seems like people start with the component skills and then they build up to doing the whole thing. In some of the literature on scaffolding, we actually talk about thinking about getting people to kind of do more like the whole thing, but with the pieces already combined, right? As a way for people to see high-level structure of the task and get involved in authentic practice sooner, and then kind of going back into the details.
Yeah.
Right? So one thing I was curious about is, like, could you think about ways of using your approach, but kind of flipping some of that? Like, can you basically impose any kind of learning scaffold structure on top, so you don't just have to go about it?
That's a great question. So for example, like, could you start with someone who's already given individual components and actually have them build a page and then go back and build the components?
Yeah, and some of it might be faked. Like, it's not like they actually built up the page. You actually give them the rendered part as if it were an image. And they position that part onto the, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's not like they figured out all the sub details yet.
Yeah.
Some of it's faked.
Yeah, so I'm not sure is the answer. But I think that definitely some combination of this would probably work. I think that one of the constraints we were trying to work with was making sure that it also aligns with actually doing a project that wasn't done. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be that case. Like, you could actually have people learning through something that was predefined and then working on real things. In that case, like, I could see a lot of different ways to think about the ordering. And I think that's a really interesting way of study.
There could potentially be value in that they then learn a way to solve the problem. And then they could apply it and actually need less structure when they do the actual task.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And just to add on that, I think that one of the weaknesses of this approach is that it's very, very structured. So it's for the novices. And I think one of the important things to think about is, like, as we build this up, how do we combine that with more adaptive structures, things like Flash organization, things like Azure Research Studios, that I think would be critical. And I think that's relating to what you're talking about.
Hi, I really enjoyed this. So I'm Selena Tulip from UNC Charlotte. Two sort of small questions. First, could you describe a little bit about what feedback was given when people did these micro tasks that were then actually rejected? Like, how did they go about getting some feedback that could allow them to do it correctly or better the next time? And also, can you talk a little bit about the overhead in creating a particular task for a bunch of users to engage in? Because it seems like it would actually be quite complex to just put that together.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So two questions. So the first one on feedback. In the scope of the study, because we didn't have that built out, the only thing that could happen is that the page manager could reject your work, and then it would go back in the pool, and someone else could pick it up. So there wasn't feedback. But how I'm imagining it really working is that the higher level roles, they're almost like a manager or a coach, and that's kind of alluding to the coaching work, where they would give you feedback, and then you could iterate, and you can even communicate with them. And I think that's one of the interesting things about that hierarchy is you can have this kind of near-peer mentoring. For the
it seems to me that you have to help coach people on how to coach, because people could do that really well.
Yes. So that is very true. Yeah. The second question about building, like actually creating this, that's another one of the major weaknesses of this, is that it takes so much time to put this together. Now, how I think about it is, in the same way that open source projects, they create a bunch of documentation, ways for you to learn, and even examples that you could try. I'm thinking about this in the same way. So if people have a particular framework that they're trying to teach, then it makes a lot of sense for them to create something that enables people to use their framework. And it's almost like a Ruby on Rails, where it's like very opinionated framework for people to ramp up.
Let's thank our speakers.